We're live. So thank you for agreeing to do an interview today with the Veteran Feminists of America for our Pioneer Histories project. You want to start just by telling me your name?
Sure. I'm Marianne Lupa and proud to share my women's movement experience with you.
Great. Tell us a little bit about when and where you were born.
Well, I was born in Chicago, Illinois in a blackout in 1942 to Stella and Joe Lupa in Chicago here at St. Mary's Hospital. And we lived in the Cragen area, which was a Polish neighborhood. I was raised Polish Catholic, to all Polish Catholic schools, namely ending up in Alverno College in Milwaukee.
So what was your life like before you got involved in the women's movement? What was your sort of everyday life like?
Well, I think that my goal from a very young age was to become a very proffered artist that would be able to have a career as an artist.
And did you know from when you were very young that art was something where you had a talent?
No doubt about it. I had that steno pad with little girls with triangle dresses. Every page had a different color. It was just, everybody knew that that was an interest of mine from a long time. Didn't know I was going to go into book design, but in the end, my mother was worried I'd be stuck in some bedroom painting from my heels. So I was very glad to get into the commercial art. And art education was not hiring. So I went into an art ed degree, but could not get a teaching job without a car.
Oh, interesting. So how did you get involved in the women's movement?
Well, I actually would have to say Alverno was a big part of that, having gone to Alverno College, because I had made a friendship with Mary Jean Collins, who was in student government. I was following her as junior class president, and she had to show me the ropes. So she said, we really should get together, and we became very fast friends. And consequently, any event that came up that she thought might be of value to me. Well, we first actually were active in open housing marches together.
This is during college?
This was after college with the NAACP.
About what year was that?
That was in 1968.
Uh-huh.
And she and I had the opportunity to march each day because they had contracts in Milwaukee that suggested that minorities could not purchase housing. And that was about a 160-day event of housing marches. Mary Jean had learned that the founders of NOW were trying to go from city to city to develop chapters locally of the National Organization for Women. And so she informed me that there was going to be a meeting at the Sherman House in Chicago, which is now the Illinois Center. It was level. And that meeting was about 25 people that had these fantastic women at the front telling us about the fact that there was not enough enforcement of Title VII, now that the word sex had been added to the Civil Rights Act.
And this was about what year, approximately?
This was in 1967.
Oh, okay, wow. And were you living in Chicago or Milwaukee at that point?
I was living in Chicago at the time and later moved to Milwaukee. The women that were so impressive to me were Alice Rossi, social scientist from University of Chicago, Kay Clarenbach from University of Wisconsin, who had been, I think, head of the commissions on the status of women, and Catherine Conroy, who was a labor organizer for Chicago women.
Quite a group to initiate you, huh?
Yes, yeah, just their rapport amongst each other, their humor was all impressive. And I remember being listed in the article about the meeting as the only artist present.
Oh, funny. Oh,
yeah.
That's awesome. So what happened from there? Did you get hooked right away, or did you?
No, I actually had decided to get into a romance, and it kind of took me into a different course whereby I had a child that I could not support. I was out of work, and at that point is why I moved to Milwaukee to actually stay with Mary Jean Collins. And we certainly enjoyed the camaraderie, but we were getting very interested in the fact that we were working for human rights, but the idea of women's rights, I was having a very difficult time getting employment, and therefore we really needed to start concentrating on maybe our own rights.
Mm.
And that's why it was significant when this meeting came up. And in 1969, I actually moved back to Chicago and became membership chair of the Chicago Now chapter, which Mary Jean was then president of. With that, I stayed with Now for 12 years till 1981, and eventually went from VP to president of the local chapter, which was an experience to behold. And of course, when I met Kathy Rand, Ann Ladke was also an experience that I had encountered in my work at Scott Forsman as a book designer. I had come back to Chicago because of a job to work in language arts. And that work was very satisfying because it was highly illustrative in handling illustration. And we had the opportunity to be near the local meeting place for the chapter, which was the YWCA on Wabash Avenue in Chicago. Had many, many lunch, or I should say dinners, at Miller's, right near the Y. And that was where we would often prime our meetings. We met there every third Thursday of the month. And I happened to be president during a period of time from 71 through 73 when the movement was burgeoning. I read recently that it quadrupled throughout the nation at the time. And that was certainly evident in my meetings, because you're talking about monthly meetings and 80 people show up. And new people, of course, which we were always glad to see. My experience with working with Mary Jean and the chapter was that we were always an action-oriented chapter.
And what kinds of issues were you mostly involved in or mostly interested in?
Well, I remember my very first one, and this was actually before I was chapter president. It was at Berghoff's, which had a men-only grill. And that grill was right across the street from where I worked at one point at Montgomery Ward's. So I couldn't run across the street to get a sandwich there very quickly, which is what everybody liked.
Only the men were busy enough and important enough
Oh
to
yeah,
be able to
right.
do that,
And
right?
you know, that was in the bar too. So we decided that in spite of the fact that a lot of people didn't think that public accommodations were the significant issues at the time, you got to see a keep out sign with the men only.
Mm-hmm.
And so it was very, very graphic to be able to, go there and picket and below the sign that said men only grill. And Berghoff's was one of the older restaurants in the city, very, very popular. Well, to our surprise, a barroom brawl started. I did not get inside of Berghoff's. However, some guys started pushing the women that came in to be spokespeople. One person was Mary Jean Collins in that instance. And consequently, we were written up by Mike Royko as having been part of a barroom brawl by putting together our actions. So that was one of the main memorable ones. We had several. We had another grill Carson Peary Scott had that was also men only. And they even opened a third one, which seemed to be not too smart at the time when we were actually being very evident that this was not appreciated by the women of the city and men in many instances. So that really, to me, was one of the memorable events. Although we did have, before I became president, because we were so small, there was the women that we met, and why they were putting together chapters was so that the national organization could be prominent in all areas of the states. Well, when we were being given national direction, which was helpful, they suggested that we picket in front of the Health, Education, and Welfare Building in Chicago. And there were only maybe 5 of us, but we represented Indiana, Wisconsin, and Illinois, which was helpful too, you know. The other thing I have to say about being president is I was not the charismatic president, probably. I was more the practical, seeing to it that we had an agenda. We started on time. We ended after having taken people's suggestions. We were always open to various ideas. And in one meeting, we had a woman who had been producing Geiger counters in her own factory above the Hyde Park Bank. And she was older than all of us, and as a fact, a Republican. Most of us were Democrats.
Right.
And she came and said that the executive club would not permit her to come to a special luncheon with Melvin Laird, the Department of Defense speaking. And she brought this up at our meeting, and of course, 80 people say, well, we're going to have to do something about that. So Kathy Rand wrote a wonderful PR statement for me to take there. Now, mind you, we were all employed, some in better jobs than others, none in managing jobs, and we'd go at lunchtime, which is what this was. Consequently, about, I would say, 8 of us went to the executive club, and the issue was to kind of get down the aisle and get to the front podium, and we did, kind of in a wedge. Meantime, gentlemen are stacking up into the lunch places, and they were not exactly thrilled with us. In fact, there was some booing and hissing that started, particularly after I started reading the statement that Kathy Rand wrote for us, saying that women should not be prohibited from participating in executive clubs if they were members. What I find very interesting now is I know a whole bunch of CEO women who are members of the executive club.
Right.
That was a shaky knees experience, but Kathy Rand kept encouraging me to continue reading the statement. And for a while, because there was TV there was also, this was the day after the Equal Rights Amendment was passed in the Senate.
Mm-hmm.
And I, like my dad, used to always keep the Sun-Times around, and it had ERA passes Senate. So I left it on Melvin Laird's plate when we departed. And with the boos and hisses, we didn't stay too long. I had my mother calling the next day saying, Mary Ann, if you're going to do this, look nice. Well, I wanted to say to her, Mother, they don't take your coat and hat when you come in unannounced to a luncheon that you're not welcome at. But that was an experience, and we became summer reruns, I think, since the press covered that quite well.
What other issue areas were you involved in?
Well, AT&T, interesting that the 2 arenas that really were big corporations, AT&T and Sears, that now was involved in, were both employers of my family. And in the case of AT&T, my recall is that I think we actually leafleted their, because they had a president called Charlie Brown, and our leaflet mentioned Charlie Brown. To the leaflet was actually kind of a newsletter to the employees, indicating to the women that they were not being promoted, that they were not being paid well and fairly. And so there was, again, Kathy Rand and I passing out leaflets at the AT&T building, or Illinois Bell at that time it was known as. And we obviously made an impact because I remember years later a woman who worked for Bell telling me she had still saved her check from the back pay that she had gotten
Oh, wow. Yeah.
from Illinois Bell for the EEOC case that was actually settled in women's favor.
Interesting.
Sears, of course, was a place where my mother worked, and my experience there as president was actually kind of backing the support of our clever staff of, not staff, but our volunteers who wanted to have Christmas be Scrooge visiting the Sears store, which was very large in Chicago, one of the mainstay stores. And again, this was a national action. There were more events taking place across the nation. And we had someone play Santa Claus and someone play Scrooge, and actually gave them a discredit card, which one of our members made. And I have to say that that too was kind of a wonderful opportunity about being in a creative field and deciding that you could get more publicity if you were more creative with your...
Right, for sure. You had lots of opportunities to use your creativity and your artistic skills over the years.
And one of our partners, actually, that I worked with, made a large discredit card that we actually handed to Sears at that point. Credit at Sears at that point, I think 1/3 of the people of the nation had Sears credit cards. The store was very, very much the kind of store that fed people for their needs in Oshkosh jeans, and it was very family oriented. Yet at the same time, the women were not sometimes just being given part-time employment because they didn't want to give them benefits, and they were not being promoted whatsoever. And it was very easy for our chapter to go into the store and count the number of employees that were female and male.
And where they were.
And it was very simple research in a way. And we presented the press with that as well as Sears. But Sears was a long-term battle, actually.
And look what's happened to them now. So.
Yes, and I was thinking the same thing,
Yeah.
that, somebody
Yeah,
really did not read the writing on the wall.
exactly. You were also on the National Board of NOW, correct?
Yes,
Yeah,
yes.
do you want to talk a little about your experience there?
On the National Board of NOW, I'm trying to think if at that time I was Illinois ERA coordinator, because that would be the other standout moment that I can recall is the National Rally for ERA in Springfield.
Uh-huh.
Because we had gotten such bad, I would say, not publicity, but our membership in NOW, there were 15 states that had passed the ERA after the Senate vote right away. Well, they didn't have Phyllis Schlafly. That's what we had in Alton, Illinois.
Yes.
And actually, we have a feeling now, in hindsight, that she was even more critical than we thought she was at the time because of her influence in the Republican Party even. She was also the opportunity for the Republicans to recruit women to the Republican Party. We saw somebody like that in Sarah Palin, but I didn't think of her that way until we had encountered Sarah Palin in our history. The National Rally for Equal Rights was the first time we ever had to have walkie-talkies when we did an action. It's the first time we had to have porta potties, and actually was very effective from the standpoint that 30 states came from around the country to actually tell our legislators in Springfield that we needed to pass the Equal Rights Amendment, and so put our state, I would have been the 35th state to pass it. And they, of course, were jockeying around between the politicians. Mayor Jane Byrne was in the lead at our rally, and I think one of the first people to speak, as well as Mary Jane Collins spoke at that rally. It was, what was expected was 5,000 people. We actually had 8, and I had heard some people even said 10,000
Really?
had
Well,
attended in
and it only
Springfield.
took 35 more years or whatever till it passed, right?
Right.
Illinois, that is.
But
Yeah.
that was an interesting happening in my term of office in the that by that time I was actually Illinois area coordinator.
Yeah,
That was
yeah.
much later. That was 76 was
Right.
the national rally
Right,
for equal rights.
right.
Yeah.
So how did your involvement in the movement affect your later life, both personally and professionally, did it?
Well, I used to run out of my office, leaving the art board behind. And the one thing about being an artist that has to make presentations of what the book design is going to appear, and I was the art director of Childcraft, a children's encyclopedia, very illustrative. You can't fake it. You have to have the actual presentation, at the committee meetings. And consequently, we'd run out at lunch meetings. But one of the things about being in a group process, which producing children's books was very much a group process, the now experience and the experience working with women in Chicago now really groomed me for a better professionalism, if you will, and a better knowledge of how to do teamwork, or even influence people like the executives who didn't quite think you had the best idea. So I felt that, no, that was very, very much, and on the other hand, I don't know if I'd even been promoted to art director had I not been involved
Right,
in the
right,
women's movement.
right. Have you been involved as an activist in the women's movement or somewhere else since your second wave experience?
I actually got involved in Women in the Director's Chair because I went into a film and video master's program at Columbia College. Fortunately, my dad was very ill at that time, and I did not complete that degree. He died in that period of time in '82. But one of my faculty members suggested I look into Women in the Director's Chair because the fact was, and still is, we don't have many women directors in the society.
Right,
And we are, hold up half the earth. So that was a good experience of actually recruiting women's films, being part of the judging group that actually held a regular festival at Facets Multimedia. I was treasurer of Women in the Director's Chair, and met a lot of talented women as a result of it. Actually, it just stopped functioning not too long ago.
Oh, really?
They were around for quite a while.
Huh.
The other interesting area that I got into, and I think it often has something to do with the fact that our church wanted to have, they had 3 women who came to the congregation and said, can we have childcare? And they said, we're even willing with your space to trade women off to take care of each other's children.
Huh.
Well, the congregation decided that this could easily be a ministry that a small congregation could support. And they started the first Concordia Child Care Center. And we now have 4
Really? Wow, that's terrific.
daycare centers.
Right,
And I was on the original council that actually took a abandoned, well, it wasn't abandoned, it was a Catholic parish that was used by the public schools and then not needed anymore, and therefore offered as a potential child care facility. And the negotiation between the Chicago Public Schools is they wanted $1 or $1 million for the property and the buildings.
right.
And fortunately, we had an attorney in our congregation who was very wise and negotiated. Actually, we ended up paying and also giving some scholarships to the city. But that's known now as Concordia Place, and is a NACI is the accreditation group that actually sets up the standards for childcare. It's a sliding scale childcare,
That's great, yeah.
and consequently, a lot of people who wouldn't have been able to afford actual rate are part of our congregation, although because money was not there from the state, we also, the other child care centers that we opened are actually at normal rate,
Uh-huh.
but we still have these 2 sliding scale, and the other 2 are like supporting.
Oh,
It's known as a
yeah.
social enterprise.
Yeah. You're currently a member of the VFA board, correct? So,
Yes, yes.
Still an activist, still involved?
Yes, can't stop. Although, I think the years that I got married, I decided that I wasn't going to one of the NOW meetings, which was in 1982, I think. And so I didn't get to the Houston conference. But it's a real special experience to be part of Veteran Feminists. And again, I have to say Kathy Rand was the one who called me and said, why don't you come on the board? Well, as a result of that, we had a Chicago reunion that was in 2004. And I think it was very interesting as we all reminisced about the fact that once we were kind of done in our activism in some ways, because other parts of our lives took us to be more satisfied designers or whatever else we went on to, we realized that we all just parted, and that it was sort of sad,
Yeah.
and that there was a real value in connecting again, which is what I think VFA did for me and for a lot of women. And we had a wonderful reunion in Chicago, and we still continue to have those with more even academic bent in some ways, with this last event that we had in North Carolina, where we had historians asking us what our experiences were. No, I'm very proud of the work in VFA, and now I'm hopefully working to help continue the oral history project that
For sure.
you're so busy with. Yeah.
Great. Anything else that we haven't covered that you want to add before we wrap up? This has been great.
Well, I had one experience when I was chapter president that I'll never forget, and I was working at Scott Forsman at the time, where I got involved in children's book illustration and layout design. And that was a father who had come to us when I was president and said, my daughter is going to build a soapbox derby with the help of myself, and would the Chicago Now chapter sponsor her, because it was the first year that they were actually having girls in the soapbox derby. Well, I was very familiar with the Akron, Ohio soapbox derby because I had cousins in it that lived in Akron. And since they asked us to sponsor it, and I was a designer, I went out to Harvey, Illinois, and actually lettered her fuchsia-colored car
Oh, well.
with Chicago National Organization for Women on it.
Oh, that's very cool.
Yeah.
Great
And
story.
she was, of course, not exactly the winner, except that she was so proud of doing it. We took photos of her. They took photos of her, and it was entered in a workbook at Scott Forsman, because that was another thing in terms of job that we all had. Is in the case of Scott Forsman, where I was in language arts, and we all reviewed the books that were being set up for reading programs. We had the opportunity to say things were, word that was not familiar, sexist. And I do have the recall, this is another kind of special event, where I actually suggested that one of the illustrations they were using was sexist. That it was a young girl leaping up on a chair next to her brother because there was a frog in the basement, and she was frightened of the frog. So I suggested to them that they, as I say, the word was just being coined. So I suggested that that was sexist and that they probably should change it. It did not get changed. It went into all the readers and then became a story in the New York Book Review when they review all the new books that come out, indicating that that particular illustration was very sexist.
Oh, funny.
Yeah.
Oh, they
Yeah.
should have listened.
They
It's
should
the
have
story of
listened.
our lives. They always should have listened.
Right. But those are, two events that I can't forget. Oh, I also have to say that being in the graphics, I've had the wonderful experience of creating for Women's Strike Day, which was another valued time in the women's movement in 1970 when with the legislative national coordinator, she asked me to create a button that was Women Strike for Women for the Strike Day 1970 that Betty Friedan had issued as a call to arms for all of us.
August 26th.
August 26, 1970, the anniversary of the 50th acquisition of the vote, and we had those buttons distributed to everybody, and it turned out that it ended up in Time magazine, and even a Chicago cartoonist had come up with the clever aspect of having a man and woman holding up the world, and both of them had the buttons around their neck,
Oh, well.
which was really kind of
Yeah,
special.
that's great.
Yeah.
Great.
We followed up with next year Women Lobby for Women, again celebrating August 26th. And the other thing that has gotten publicity, and even to this day, is Don't Iron While the Strike is Hot, which was one of the creations for the now 1970 strike. And that now is in the, help me, Harvard
Schlesinger.
Library. Actually, Harvard asked if they could also put it into their collection.
That's
And
fabulous.
so-
Yeah.
That was a case of having several artists on, again, in our chapter, that we were asking people to not iron while the strike is hot, but also cover your typewriters and cover your phone hang-ups. And therefore, we had flyers for each one of these industries and asked everybody to stop. People did not strike for the complete day, but we sure had a turnout for lunch, and that group that was at the Civic Center in Chicago spilled into the streets.
I recall.
So that was the graphics experience. I kind of call it social action graphics, which myself and many of my colleagues really appreciated being able to make those kinds of contributions, because they always got press and attention from
Sure.
everybody.
They lasted forever.
Buttons get worn.
Right.
So
Exactly.
yeah.
Well, Marianne, thank you so much for taking the time. This was fantastic, and look forward to highlighting you on the VFA website with your story.
I know I didn't tell you what I